Today was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol.
I'm still trying to wrap my brain around what happened. I thought we were going to have to fight our way out.
We will not be kept out of this chamber by thugs, mobs, or threats.
This country is a nation of laws and not of men.
All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough. I've tried to be helpful.
To those who wreaked havoc in our Capitol today, you did not win. Violence never wins. Freedom wins. And may God bless the United States of America. Let's get back to work.
Tonight, Congress is finishing the job. They will certify Joe Biden's Electoral College victory.
Representatives and senators returned to work about 6 hours after a mob of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building.
And within the hour, we have confirmed 4 people died in today's protests. 1 woman was shot by police. 3 other people died after a medical emergency. Several other rioters were taken to the hospital, and 14 D.C. police officers had to be treated for their injuries.
And it really is such a struggle to find any comparison of what we all watched today. Trump supporters overwhelming Capitol Police and then taking over the U.S. Capitol by force, interrupting the Electoral College process.
Truly disturbing images. A noose outside the Capitol, a Confederate flag inside the Capitol. That didn't even happen during the Civil War.
We saw people climbing the balcony of the Senate, scaling the Capitol facade. And this smiling Trump supporter there carrying the podium with the Speaker of the House logo on it.
And then there were lawmakers ducking in their seats, trying to protect themselves and each other. Within the last hour, we learned D.C. will be under state of emergency until after Inauguration Day.
And tonight, Denver7 brings you 360 coverage of the chaos in our nation's capital. You're going to hear perspectives from Republicans, Democrats, independent voters, protesters, and legal experts, all weighing on the same question: what do we do after today here in the country going forward? We're going to begin with our chief investigative reporter, Tony Kovaleski. Tony?
A day our generation will never forget. World leaders called it disgraceful, actions and images not expected from the United States. While others simply called it an attack on American democracy. The chaos began shortly after noon Eastern. It followed this speech by President Trump.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
The president promising never to concede.
We will never give up. We will never concede.
President Trump also called on his vice president to ignore the will of the people and overturn the election.
Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election.
The president's supporters then marched to the Capitol. Inside, the vice president officially breaking from the president, telling lawmakers he will follow the Constitution, follow the vote of the people, and ignore the president's demands. Also inside, Congress began the process of certifying the electoral vote, including Colorado Congressman Joe Neguse and newly elected Lauren Boebert.
You cannot change the rules of an election while it is underway and expect the American people to trust it.
With respect to my new colleague from Colorado, the question is not whether Joe Biden was elected the 46th president of the United States. He clearly was.
Moments later, about 90 minutes after the president called on his supporters to march on the Capitol, this video. The unthinkable, the unforgettable, a non-peaceful protest. Protesters breaking their way into the Capitol, a lawless outbreak in a building where our country's laws are debated and created.
Get down under your chairs if necessary, so we have folks entering the rotunda.
In a matter of minutes, senators and members of Congress rushed from the chambers, some ducking and covering, trying to find some sort of safety, while doors were barricaded and guns were drawn. And this remarkable picture of Colorado Congressman Jason Crow. You can see the concern in his eyes. Then at 3 p.m. Eastern, about 3 hours after the president's speech, pictures from inside the Capitol started circulating. This protester made his way to the office of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, another protester in the Senate chamber, proclaiming President Trump won the election. Now at 4 p.m., the president's press secretary tweeting the D.C. National Guard was being mobilized.
This is not dissent, it's disorder.
And then President-elect Biden calling for action from President Trump.
I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
While protesters continued their assault on the Capitol, now about 30 minutes after the speech by the president-elect, President Trump released a 1-minute recorded video on Twitter, again falsely claiming the election was stolen.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
Published reports show protesters remained in the Capitol until at least 5:30 p.m. Eastern. A half hour later, a much stronger police presence outside, and curfew began in our nation's capital. It was an afternoon where one woman was killed, and the history of this presidency and our country forever changed. But at 8 p.m. Eastern, the vice president reconvened the Congress, sending a message: the protesters would not stop our democracy.
To those who wreaked havoc in our capital today, you did not win. Violence never wins. And may God bless the United States of America. Let's get back to work.
And the next 24 hours promise to provide even more political drama. The president's closest allies tonight, senators, cabinet members, and White House staff, distancing themselves, look for more discussion about possible impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment, which allows for a president not fit to serve to be removed. Shannon?
Tony Kovaleski. Tony, thanks for that report. And once again, you saw it a little bit earlier. This photo of Colorado Congressman Jason Crow in the House, just remarkable. He is an Army Ranger. He was trying to get people on the ground as those rioters broke into the Capitol.
Denver7's Gary Broad spoke to Crow just before Congress went back into session tonight. And Gary, Congressman Crow and other lawmakers sharing similar reactions to what happened today.
A lot of feelings really worked through after today, whether it's anger, disbelief, or just flat out sadness for our country. Representatives Ken Buck and Jason Crow were barricaded inside House chambers as the mob tried and eventually succeeded in getting in. And at one point, Jason Crow tells me he thought they were going to have to fight their way out.
We of this Congress and this administration.
What started as a contentious debate on the House floor.
They broke the glass.
Ends with lawmakers hiding on the floor.
I never thought for a moment in my life that I'd be called upon to have to fight my way out of the House floor as a member of U.S. Congress.
Representative Jason Crow was one of about 20 congressmen and women who didn't get out of the House chambers in time.
They closed the doors and actually took furniture and started to barricade the doors and windows as the mob tried to break down the doors and windows.
Representative Crow snapped a picture of that moment. He says it's an image seared in his mind.
The Capitol Police, they had their guns drawn and they were ready to kind of make our last stand if we needed to. That was a very dark moment and one I'm still kind of coming to terms with.
Representative Ken Buck was also there.
You could hear that the doors, people were trying to force their way through the doors. About 5 or 10 minutes after that, the glass started breaking in the doors around the House floor. And it was clear that at some point the House floor would be breached.
Both representatives struggling to process the extremist acts on our nation's capital.
This was clearly a threat to our country, and it was more than just a riot over a sporting event or some other activity. This was really designed to shut down a key function in our government, and it can't be allowed.
When the electoral session resumed, Democratic Senator Michael Bennet was one of the first to speak. The senator compared today's actions to the ones that caused the fall of the Roman Empire.
And these armed gangs ran through the streets of Rome, keeping elections from being started, keeping elections from ever being called. And in the end, Because of that, the Roman Republic fell and a dictator took its place.
Minutes before the electoral count was stopped, newly elected Congresswoman Lauren Boebert voiced her objection to the election results.
My primary objection to the counting of the electoral votes.
Boebert tweeted as the riots were taking place that she was safe and that she supports peaceful protest and the rule of law and denounced all acts of violence. We reached out to all other state lawmakers, whether by tweet or by statement. They tell us they are all safe and that they all condemn the actions of earlier today. Reporting live here in Denver, Gary Brode, Denver7.
Thank you, Gary. And President Trump's calls for peace were taken down by Twitter because they also contain lies about the election and could potentially incite more violence. One read, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away." As you know, he lost the election. Twitter also took down a minute-long video in which the president eventually called for rioters to leave the Capitol after 40 seconds of election-related complaints.
And Twitter took an unprecedented step of locking the president's account for 12 hours. It also threatened to kick him off permanently for making threats and calls to violence, which are against the Twitter rules. The company says it is working proactively to protect the health of the public conversation. And soon after they did that, Facebook did the same, blocking Trump from posting. And also tonight, ABC News is reporting there are members of Trump's cabinet tonight considering the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. 17 members of Congress also signed a letter to Vice President Pence asking him to invoke the 25th Amendment.
2 members of the White House team resigned today, and others may follow. Denver7 investigator Jennifer Kovaleski continues our 360 coverage with perspective from one of Colorado's leading political scientists who called today's events a fraught moment in history.
How would you describe the events at the U.S. Capitol today?
I mean, extraordinary. It'd be hard to see it as anything other than some sort of an insurrection.
What do you think the political implications of this could be?
It certainly makes President Trump looks like he was inciting this violence, and it makes the members of Congress who were supportive of these objections look like they were essentially complicit in it. President Trump was out there this morning in a speech.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
He was certainly doing what he could to encourage this.
What are your thoughts about the calls by Democratic lawmakers for Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment?
For the most part, the 25th Amendment was really not designed for this sort of thing. The 25th Amendment is largely for a situation where the president is essentially unconscious or unresponsive and simply cannot execute the job. But I think that idea is being taken a lot more seriously after today's events.
What would have to happen in order to invoke the 25th Amendment?
Essentially, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet would need to sign a document saying that they're calling on the president to step down. Vice President Pence would then become president for just those 2 weeks, and then there would be the transition to Biden. I don't know how likely this is to happen. The cabinet still consists of people who are very loyal to Donald Trump.
Could this have lasting impacts on our democracy?
It certainly could. For one thing, there's simply the security matter. When there have been violent attacks on the U.S. Capitol grounds or in front of the White House, we've often seen security ramp up, and those often remain. Basically, people's access to these buildings becomes a little more restricted. I also think we'll probably see people taking, what you might call white supremacist violence or domestic terrorism a lot more seriously.
I'm Denver7 investigator Jennifer Kovaleski.
And the events in Washington are front page news around the world. One of Germany's largest newspapers, the Tagesspiegel, put an image of the standoff at the Capitol on its front page. The headline, "Shots in the Capitol." Britain's Metro called it anarchy in the U.S. The Daily Telegraph, democracy under siege.
And you don't have to look far to find a historical comparison. Just 6 months ago, we saw people take to the streets of Denver, angry about the killing of George Floyd. More than 100 were arrested, tear gas deployed for hours. Today in D.C., 26 arrests on Capitol grounds, 5 weapons recovered, videos circulating on social media of rioters taking selfies with Capitol Police. One rioter had a military member take her by the hand and gently walk her down the steps of the same Capitol she'd just broken into. Well, Denver7 CB Cotton continues our 360 coverage tonight with multiple perspectives on the handling of these 2 events. CB?
And well, many Coloradans and local leaders took to social media today to share their thoughts on the events that unfolded at the U.S. Capitol. Some of those thoughts a reflection on the similarities and differences between today and the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer. As Trump supporters made their way to and inside the Capitol, people made their way to social media with comments criticizing the president and some supporting him and some mentioning Black Lives Matter. A time in our nation's history where people were also vocal in support of what they believe in. But are the beliefs treated differently? We're going 360 with what people think. We start with Denver Public School Board Director Tay Anderson, who's publicly voiced his support of Black Lives Matter.
If this was Black Lives Matter storming the Capitol, not only would, again, I don't believe they would have even gotten close to the Capitol, for one, and two, there would have been mass arrests. There would have been more force by police officers. It would have been an entirely different scene.
Now 360 to Trump supporters who protested on Wednesday at the Colorado State Capitol. Some of them feel differently.
BLM did way worse. We're here to make sure that we stay free. We're here to make sure this doesn't turn into another communist, socialist.
And 360 again to those who've spoken out against the summer's protest and the one at the U.S. Capitol. Republican and former Colorado Governor Bill Owens writing in part on Facebook, quote, "And just as I was very critical of the protesters who attacked and vandalized our state capitol, I am outraged at those protesters who attacked the very symbol of our nation's democracy, the U.S. Capitol. Perhaps we can now all agree that this is wrong." However you view Black Lives Matter or the D.C. insurrection, here was the response. On Wednesday at the D.C. Capitol, a brief moment of tear gas, mace, and flash grenades. But during the summer's George Floyd demonstrations in D.C., tear gas was used for hours. And in Denver, a 94-page report by the Denver's Office of the Independent Monitor, released in early December, said chemical agents were also deployed on peaceful protesters.
There's controversy right now on where's the disparities in the response coming from.
Dr. April Alexander is an associate professor at DU and a Black Lives Matter activist. She says response to both events is directly tied to our country's history.
A lot of it is empowered by white supremacy. We talk a lot in psychology about racism, discrimination, and prejudice. And what we've seen these last few months and years of this current administration is that individuals who are holding racist or nationalist ideology have been emboldened and empowered.
CB Cotton, Denver7.
And we do want to tell you about the pro-Trump group that gathered outside the Colorado State Capitol today. At least 2 people were arrested there. This one was fairly peaceful with some shouting going on. We did not see any large-scale clashes between protesters and police.
And while there weren't widespread arrests during today's riot in Washington, Vice President Pence promised the people who broke into the Capitol, trampled on democracy, will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Denver7's Addie Guajardo continues our 360 coverage with perspective on how these criminals could be punished.
Well, and arrests have been made and more arrests are expected. I spoke to our Colorado former Attorney General, and she described what she saw unfold on television as an act of terrorism, saying she witnessed not only crimes that were felony, misdemeanors, and federal misdemeanor charges as well. Now, we also spoke to a legal analyst who gave us a little bit of insight as to President Trump's power and how he can protect his supporters. The fear and the chaos captured on camera is palpable.
We have never seen anything like this before. You see those protesters inside the Capitol.
There's no excuse. There's no freedom of speech. There's no right to do what these folks did today. It was terrorism.
Former Colorado Attorney General Cynthia Kaufman says she felt heartache and anger, adding that the Capitol security showed enormous restraint.
They had a right to fire on the folks who entered the Capitol, and they didn't.
She tallied in her head a series of federal crimes, trespass, vandalism, and the most serious of them all.
They were threatening the lives of public officials when they committed the acts that they did. Those are potentially punishable by life in prison.
With the eyes of the world on our nation's capital and surveillance cameras rolling, prosecutors have a wealth of evidence.
They've actually made it fairly easy for a prosecutor.
Legal analyst David Beller.
It's going to take law enforcement weeks to go through all the video footage.
Says it will be up to the acting attorney general and President Trump's administration to bring forth charges, and Trump gets a say.
Trump has 2 more weeks in order to pardon every one of these individuals.
If no action is taken by President Trump, President-elect Joe Biden's attorney general can take over and bring forth charges against people who committed crimes. Now, at this time, we are hearing reports that weapons have been recovered, but none of those weapons have been said to have been recovered at the state capitol. A legal analyst says if that changes, if someone did take a weapon into the state capitol, they could be sentenced up to 10 years in federal prison. Now, Attorney General Phil Weiser is also calling for accountability for anyone who incited violence. Reporting live in Denver, Addie Guajardo, Denver 7.
This is not America. Americans do not storm the United States Capitol building. They don't smash in windows, rush in and overpower Capitol Police. Members of the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate do not shelter in place inside the Capitol because they are afraid of Americans. In America, disputes over government and politics are settled by courts and laws, not violence and threats and mob behavior. And in the irony of ironies here, the violence, the criminal activity at the Capitol is being done by people waving American flags, attacking the seat of American government under the banner of the American flag. What are they trying to prove? That they love democracy so much they're willing to cause injury and destruction because their candidate lost in a free and open election. This is the behavior we see in banana republics, in unstable third world countries, not in the world's oldest democracy. And why is all this happening? Over allegations of voter fraud. Unfounded, untrue, false allegations of fraud. It's not as if the Department of Justice found there was voter fraud in this presidential election and it was ignored. No, the Attorney General said there was no widespread voter fraud. It's not as if the courts found there was voter fraud and that was ignored. No, legal challenges to the presidential election have now been thrown out by some 60 courts. And in this country, that's all we have. That's how the founders set the whole deal up. We have courts, we have laws. That is the great experiment that seems so improbable in 1776. That's not America. This is not America. In America, sometimes your team wins elections, sometimes it loses. In America, political opponents are not enemies. This is not America, except obviously it is. Ronald Reagan called this country a shining city upon a hill. And tonight, it shines a little dimmer. And quickly, an update out of Washington as we take a live look at the Capitol Dome. An objection to the electoral results from Pennsylvania is moving forward right now. The House and Senate meeting in their respective chambers to debate. At this rate, it could be another hour or so, at least, before the Electoral College results are certified. Stick around. Michael, have your forecast next.